if I may start by introducing Professor Achcar. Professor Achcar works at SOAS in London, has previously worked in Beirut, Paris, and Berlin. He is the author of a number of books. I think I've read most of them. One book, for example, on the Arab Spring.
I just received the new edition.
Oh, very nice. So they have the new edition of the Arab Spring, updated
again. With a new preface. People want.
Perfect. The people want. I also read the book on the Arabs and the Holocaust, which is about the reception of the Holocaust in the Arab world, as well as a number of others. One interview book with Noam Chomsky. So all in all, I'm quite indebted to Gilbert for teaching me a few things about the region. And of course, he's also been my PhD supervisor, which is why we know each other. Gilbert, my first question. You are very critical of the role of neoliberalism in the Middle East and North Africa. So do you think that neoliberalism never works for development? Or do you think that there's something specific about the Middle East, which is why neoliberalism has failed as a recipe for development?
Well, first of all, I mean, if you're asking me the question, that's because you read my book, where I discuss this issue. And what I say is basically that to explain the situation in the Middle East and North Africa only by neoliberalism is not a convincing explanation, because then some people could point to some countries of the global south which achieved much better results than the Arab countries, while following neoliberal recipes. India, for instance, Turkey, if we consider Turkey to be part of the global south, Chile or whatever, you have a number of countries where basically the same general neoliberal recipes were followed, but which achieved very different results in development, industrialization, and the rest. So the issue here is that in the Arab countries, and I would say also in many other countries of the global south, there are no conditions of the type that would allow for some development under the neoliberal conditions. And because these conditions, neoliberalism is a dogmatic perspective, which is based on an idealist or idealized version of capitalism. So it presupposes the ideal capitalism, if you want, which does not really exist, of free market, free competition, etc. Well, we are very, very, very far from that in the Arab countries, where you have dominance by states, by ruling groups, with a lot of crony capitalism and nepotism and the rest, which makes this whole recipe fail. This is the neoliberal view is based on the dogmatic principle that the private sector should be the driving force of the economy. Now, most successful developmental stories were stories where the state, the public sector, played a key role. And that also applies to China, which has the most impressive rates of development. China has been characterized by a major role of the public sector in investment. So what happened in countries like the Arab countries where the neoliberal model was imposed, what happened is that public investment was curtailed, very much diminished, reduced, with the idea that the private investment would compensate. This didn't happen. And therefore, you have this very low growth and record rates of unemployment, youth unemployment, the highest rates of youth unemployment in the world. So there are some conditions in some countries where you have a dynamic private sector of medium enterprises and the rest, where the export-led model under neoliberal conditions may work. But these are more exceptions than the rule for the global south. Or at least there are specific cases, but you have so many other cases where the neoliberal model failed completely. And even when it succeeds, the rates of growth are much less impressive than those of the developmentalist era, when the state was leading development. One. Two, unlike the developmentalist era, where social inequalities were reduced, the neoliberal model of development, even when it is successful, goes along with a huge increase in social inequalities between the richest and the poorest in society. So that's what we can say about this.
Yeah. So you would argue that state investment did go down in the Middle East, but private investment didn't come up. Basically, the state wasn't replaced with private forces. So it's really a question about statehood and how the states are made up, right? I mean, in the Middle East, we don't have this Weberian type of legal, rational, impersonal state, right? And you write about this a lot. Could you maybe like characterize the Arab state or the predominance of
there is no the Arab state.
Yeah.
There are Arab states, right? And a variety of them, but they fall into two patterns. First, you have patrimonial states, fully patrimonial states, where the ruling group owns the state completely, as if in absolute monarchies. Well, you have 8 monarchies anyway in the Arab world, and they are all basically absolute monarchies, even when they have parliaments, because the sovereignty is the king's prerogative. So the king can get rid of parliament or whatever they want, or the emir, or whatever the title. And then, and that includes also so-called republics like Syria of the Assads, or Libya of Gaddafi before he got overthrown and killed. These were also patrimonial states, because although they called themselves republics, but they were exactly like monarchies, with ruling family completely owning the state and transmitting power by, hereditary. And then you have neo-patrimonial states, that are states where there is some, there is a distance between the institution of the state and the ruling group. So there is no ownership of the state by any group, but there is the collective institution, which in some cases is the army. 3 Arab countries, Egypt, Sudan, and Algeria, are ruled by the army. So in such countries, the army can remove the president when the president is discredited. Whereas in the patrimonial state, the president or the rulers, king, president, whatever they are, control completely the armed forces through family links, through tribal links, sectarian links, whatever. So you have these 2 categories, and all these states are to a certain degree rentier state economically, which gives the state even more autonomy vis-a-vis society. So these are the features of the system of states in the Arab world, which means even the neo-patrimonial state have a higher even degree of nepotism and cronyism than other neo-patrimonial states in the global south. So these conditions explain why the neoliberal idea that the private sector would perform miracles failed completely, because private money does not take risks under such conditions, and does not go into long-term heavy investment. It seeks quick profit, and you have a lot of capital flight, a lot of money leaving the region, going to fiscal paradise, Panama, whatever, Switzerland, and the rest. So that's what you have.
Thank you. So the revolution or the revolts of 2010 to 11 didn't really manage to capture those states, be it patrimonial or neo-patrimonial, right? And I remember quite well, like watching these revolts, also being in Egypt, the sense of hope after they occurred, right? Or whilst they were occurring. This sense of hope has been replaced with a sense of despair, I think it's fair to say, even though the revolts were sort of like ongoing, and we've seen recent waves of revolts as well. So could you name the main factors that explain the lack of success, so to say, in capturing the state and transforming society?
Well, I would say despair. The fight is going on. Even in a country like Syria, which has gone through the worst tragedy of all countries. Even there, you can see, even the areas controlled by the regime, you still have social protests going on and the rest. In Sudan, the fight is still going on. The popular movement is still fighting. And overall, I mean, even when people have suffered defeats, like in Egypt, the anger is just growing, and I think it should be rather clear that there is no stability in the long run in any of the region's countries. So what started in 2011 is what I call the long-term revolutionary process, which will go on like historical revolutionary processes. Even if you take single countries like France, China, I mean, the revolution went through various phases. For instance, 1911 in China, you had something, 1925, then you had the Liberation War, and 1949, etc. It's a long-term process. France, for some historians, France only reached completed its transformation a century after the French Revolution began in 1789, or a little less than a century. So here we're speaking not of one country, we're speaking of an ensemble of countries. So maybe the comparison should be with Western Europe, for instance. How long it took for Western Europe to move from monarchies, absolutist monarchies, into modern democratic regimes. So, of course, in our era, in our time, history goes much faster. And but it will take decades. It has already taken, well, I mean, since it started 13 years, we've had already 2 waves, one in 2011. 6 countries had major uprisings. One in 2019, 4 more countries. And one could even add a 5th, which is Jordan in 2018. So you have at least 10 countries representing half the states of the region. Half the states of the region have gone through major uprisings. So just imagine the same in Western Europe.
Yeah.
Just imagine that. So it gives you an idea of the scope of what's going on, and it will carry on. It will carry on. There will be further waves. There will be more upsurge and more backlash. There will be more revolution and more counter-revolution. That's the dialectics of history in long-term processes, until one of two things: either the region finds, either some leaderships emerge that can lead the change to success, and therefore put their countries on the track of new development, or you will have more of the tragic spiral of violence that we have seen in recent years.